Hi, I'm Janet. I'm 33 years old. And last Christmas, I walked back into my parents' house for the first time in years. I thought maybe my success, my career in Chicago, and the life I had built would finally earn me the respect I had been craving since I was a child. At first, everything seemed normal. The decorations, the dinner, the laughter. But underneath it all was the same silence I had always felt. Then, in the middle of Christmas dinner, my father fixed his eyes on me and said, I didn't deserve a seat at his table. My world stopped in that moment. What I said back left everyone frozen in their chairs, their faces pale, their voices gone. And that night, our family changed forever. Stay with me. Because the truth behind what happened will make you question just how far pride, money, and silence can go before everything breaks. But before that night could unfold, before the glass in my hand and the silence that followed, you need to understand how I became the daughter who was always looking in from the outside, the one who never quite belonged. I was 33 years old when I finally admitted to myself that I had been the invisible child all along. Growing up in the Whitmore family in a small suburb outside Cleveland, I was the youngest of four. My oldest sister Sandra was the golden one, the perfect daughter who stayed close to home, married her high school sweetheart, and had 3 children before she turned 30. My middle sister Beverly became a nurse, always praised for her selflessness and sacrifice. My brother Ron, only 2 years older than me, was the baby boy in my father's eyes, the one who could do no wrong even when he stumbled. And then there was me, Janet, the daughter who dreamed too big, the one who was told again and again that I cared too little about family and too much about myself. My father Robert was the voice that shaped most of that belief. He was a man who valued tradition, loyalty, and obedience. In his eyes, being a good daughter meant living within 10 miles of home, being available whenever he called, and showing gratitude for his approval. He never understood me, the girl who read marketing books in high school, who stayed up late planning imaginary ad campaigns instead of helping with church bake sales. He would shake his head and mutter that I thought I was smarter than everyone else. Those words still echoed in my mind when I moved to Chicago after college, the day he barely looked at me before turning back to his newspaper. Life in Chicago was lonely at first. I worked long hours at a small firm, barely making enough to pay rent on my 1-bedroom apartment. But I pushed myself. Over the years, I climbed every rung of the ladder, eventually joining Summit Strategies, a Fortune 500 marketing firm. By 33, I was managing a team of 15, running multi-million-dollar campaigns, and making a 6-figure salary. My apartment overlooked Lake Michigan, glass windows that reflected the city lights at night, a view that reminded me daily of how far I had come. Yet, despite the accomplishments, the promotions, the security, there was always a hollow ache. For 3 years, since Christmas of 2020, I had not gone home. At first I blamed work, the impossible deadlines, the travel. The truth was harder. Each call home felt like another reminder of how small I was in their eyes. My mother Evelyn would spend 20 minutes telling me about Sandra's kids, Beverly's night shifts, Ron's construction projects. If I mentioned a campaign I had worked on or a client I had landed, she would murmur that was nice, and then move on. With each call, my words mattered less. By the time I stopped answering altogether, no one seemed to notice. It was early December of 2024 when my phone lit up with my mother's number. For reasons I still cannot explain, I answered. Her voice was softer than I remembered. She told me she wanted everyone together this Christmas. She said the house had been decorated, the tree already standing in the living room, that Sandra's kids were asking about their Aunt Janet. She told me it would mean so much if I came. Something in me cracked. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to think that maybe they were ready to see me differently. Not as the selfish dreamer, but as the woman I had become. I told her yes, The moment I hung up, a wave of nervous energy rushed through me. For the first time in years, I had a chance to walk back into that house. Not as the overlooked child, but as someone who had built a life. I began planning. If they could not see my worth through words, maybe they would through actions. I went shopping with purpose. For my mother, I chose a new iPad with a leather case. Imagining her smiling as she used it to FaceTime me, instead of waiting for me to call. For Sandra's kids, I picked out a gaming console, art supplies, and books that matched each of their personalities. For Beverly, who never took time for herself, I bought a spa weekend at a luxury resort. For Ron and his wife Megan, I chose an elegant set of stainless steel kitchen tools for their apartment. The receipts stacked up quickly. By the end, I had spent over $2,000. I told myself it was worth it. That each package was more than a gift. It was a statement. I rented a sleek black BMW. Something that would make a quiet but undeniable impression when I pulled into the driveway. I booked a first-class ticket from Chicago to Cleveland. For once, I wanted the journey itself to feel like success. The night before my flight, I sat in my apartment with bags lined up near the door. My best friend Lauren called. Her voice steady and warm. She had been with me through every rejection, every lonely holiday, every small victory. When I told her about the gifts, about the BMW, about the first-class seat, she hesitated. "Janet," she said, "I am glad you are proud. But remember, people do not change overnight. Do not expect them to become someone else because of what you bring." I laughed it off, trying to sound confident. But her words stayed with me. What if she was right? Still, as I looked at the pile of carefully wrapped boxes, I felt hoppsvelling inside me. I pictured my father's stern expression softening, my mother's eyes lighting with pride, my siblings finally looking at me as more than the one who left. I told myself this Christmas would be different. For the first time in a long time, I let myself believe it. And with that thought, I zipped my suitcase shut and placed the tickets on top, ready to step back into the world I had left behind. The hum of the city outside my apartment seemed sharper that night, like the sound of a place that had become both my sanctuary and my fortress. I walked past the window and looked out at Lake Michigan, glimmering under the winter sky, its waters reflecting the silver of the moon. My suitcase sat ready by the door. But something inside me refused to let the night end without one last round of preparation. I moved back to the dining table where stacks of wrapped gifts were waiting, each one chosen with such deliberate care that it felt less like shopping and more like staging. For my mother, Evelyn, the iPad still shone under its paper wrapping. I had found the perfect case. A soft leather in the exact shade of blue she always wore on Sundays when she dressed for church. I imagined her opening it and, for the first time, calling me instead of waiting for me to call her. For Sandra's kids, I had gone overboard, but I told myself it was necessary. The new gaming console was tucked next to a box of watercolors for Grace and a science activity kit for Luke. For little Ella, I chose a stack of picture books that might hold her attention longer than a few minutes. Each gift carried a silent message: I know you. I see you. And I care. For Beverly, I had placed a voucher for a spa weekend inside a silver envelope. The thought of her finally getting a massage or a facial instead of working back-to-back shifts at the hospital gave me a small sense of satisfaction. For Ron and his wife Megan, a gleaming stainless steel kitchen set promised to make their new apartment feel a little more complete. By the time I added it all up, I had crossed the $2,000 mark. I sat back in the chair and exhaled slowly. The number felt large, but also strangely small compared to what I wanted. It was not about generosity for its own sake. It was about crafting a moment where they could not dismiss me anymore. I pulled my phone closer and confirmed the details of my first-class ticket to Cleveland. The thought of walking onto that plane, glass of champagne in hand, gave me a rush of pride. I had never flown that way before, always settling for cramped coach seats. telling myself to save the money. This time, I wanted the entire trip to echo success. I had already arranged for a sleek black BMW to be waiting at the airport. I could picture the crunch of tires on the familiar driveway, the sound of doors opening, and the first look in their eyes when they saw me step out. The next morning, I allowed myself a detour before work. There was a boutique on Michigan Avenue. I had passed countless times but never entered. The displays in the window shimmered with velvet and silk. Dresses meant to be worn by women who demanded attention without ever raising their voices. I pushed open the door and felt the air shift. The quiet hum of soft music surrounding me. A saleswoman approached with a practiced smile. "Looking for something special?" she asked. "Yes," I answered, more certain than I expected. "I need something that says I belong in any room I walk into." She tilted her head, assessing me, then disappeared into the racks. Minutes later, she returned with a deep emerald green dress. The moment I slipped it over my head and stood in front of the mirror, I knew the fabric clung in the right places. The neckline was elegant, without being revealing, and the color pulled the light into my eyes. I turned slightly and caught my reflection from the side. I saw a woman who no longer begged to be accepted, but expected it. That evening, back in my apartment, Lauren called. Her voice carried the familiar steadiness of someone who had been through my highs and lows for more than a decade. "So," she said, "tell me about the plan." I paced the length of my living room, my heels clicking against the floor. "It is simple," I told her. "I am going home, and I am walking in as the woman I have become. I have the gifts, the car, the dress, the seat on that plane. They will see me differently." Lawan Sai-hu. And I could almost picture her shaking her head in her New York apartment. "Janet, I love you. But listen to me. Families do not rewrite their stories overnight. You cannot expect one holiday to erase years of being overlooked." I paused near the window, looking out at the glow of the city below. "Maybe not overnight," I said softly. "But success changes the way people look at you. It always does." She stayed quiet for a beat. "I just do not want you setting yourself up to be disappointed again." I forced a laugh, unwilling to let her words settle in my chest. "Do not worry about me," I said. "This time will be different." After we hung up, I wandered back to the bedroom. The emerald dress hung neatly in its garment bag, waiting for its debut. I unzipped it again, slipped it on, and stood in front of the mirror. The woman staring back at me was not the girl who had left Ohio 3 years earlier. This was someone stronger. Someone who had survived the silence and the dismissal and had built a life out of it. I smoothed the fabric down my hips and studied the reflection, the pearl earrings catching the light, my hair falling in soft waves. I lifted my chin just slightly, imagining the moment I would walk into that living room. The Christmas lights twinkling, the air heavy with pine and cinnamon. And for once, they would have to stop and see me. I stood there longer than I needed to, holding on to that image as if it could anchor me against whatever storm might wait on the other side of the holiday. In that quiet moment, with the city buzzing outside and the suitcase by the door, I let myself believe that the story I had carried for years could finally change, and as I turned off the lights and set the dress carefully aside, the thought of stepping back into that world filled me with both fear and anticipation. The kind that made sleep come late and the morning arrive too soon. The flight from Chicago was smooth, and by the time I landed in Cleveland, the sun was just beginning to dip low in the winter sky. I picked up the rental car, a black BMW that looked almost out of place in the modest airport lot, and slid behind the wheel. The leather felt cool beneath my hands. The engine hummed with a confidence that steadied my nerves. As I pulled onto the highway, the city skyline faded behind me, and the suburbs stretched out ahead, each mile carrying me closer to a house that lived in both my fondest and most painful memories. Snow had fallen earlier in the week, leaving patches of white clinging to lawns and rooftops. By the time I turned onto my parents' street, the sky had turned gray, and the neighborhood looked quiet, almost frozen in time. I slowed as I pulled into the familiar driveway, my tires crunching against the icy gravel. The house itself looked smaller than I remembered. Its blue siding faded, the front steps slightly cracked. The Christmas decorations were there, but they felt tired. A string of colored lights sagged across the porch, half of them flickering weakly. The tree inside, visible through the front window, leaned just a little to the side, its branches sparse and drooping. For a moment I sat in the car, gripping the steering wheel, my breath visible in the cold air. It was strange to see it this way. As a child, Christmas at this house had always seemed magical, bursting with lights and smells and noise. Now it looked like a faded photograph. The gloss worn off, I forced myself to gather my things, grabbed the carefully wrapped boxes from the back seat, and walked up the path. The door opened before I could knock. My mother Evelyn stood there, her cardigan buttoned wrong, her gray hair tied back loosely. She smiled, but it was the polite smile she gave to neighbors, not the kind that spilled over with joy. She hugged me quickly, almost lightly, as if she was unsure how much contact I could tolerate. "You made it," she said. I nodded and stepped inside. The smell of pine mixed with something baking in the oven drifted through the air. My father Robert appeared in the hallway. His hair was thinner than the last time I saw him, his frame a little heavier, but the expression was the same. Stern, reserved. A man who saw the world in categories of duty and failure. His eyes swept over me, taking in my coat, my bags, the carefully styled hair, and he gave a curt nod. "You look professional," he said, as if it were an observation, not a compliment. Sandra arrived next, bustling through the door with her 3 children trailing behind her. Luke at 9 tried to act older than he was. Grace at 7 clutched a box wrapped in shiny paper, and little Ella at 5 cried because her mittens had fallen off. Sandra looked frazzled but put together in a way that said she was used to being the center of my mother's attention. "Janet," she exclaimed, rushing forward to hug me. "Look at you." The children stared up at me shyly. Luke gave me a firm handshake, like a miniature adult. Grace mumbled hello, and Ella refused to let go of Sandra's leg. A few minutes later, Beverly arrived, still in her nurse scrubs, her hair pulled back in a bun. "Sorry, I'm late," she said, hugging Mom first, then Sandra, then me. "You look great." "Janet, how was the flight?" "First class actually makes a difference," I replied before I could stop myself. The words slipped out like a brag, and Beverly raised an eyebrow, smiling faintly. "Fancy," she said, her tone light, but edged with something I could not quite name. Ron and his wife Megan walked in last. Ron looked healthy, his cheeks flushed from the cold, and Megan gave me a shy smile as Ron pulled me into a bear hug. "My little sister," he said warmly. "Good to see you." "Megan's sweet. You'll like her." I smiled at her and handed over the kitchen set I had chosen for them. She gasped softly, thanking me, though she whispered that their kitchen might be too small for some of the pieces. I set the rest of the gifts under the tree, and the children immediately tore into their packages with squeals of delight. Luke shouted when he saw the console. Grace hugged her art kit to her chest, and Ella flipped through the books. Sandra watched them with a forced smile and kept saying, "I hope you didn't spend too much." "Janet, you really didn't need to do all this." Beverly opened her envelope, her face softening for a moment before she said she probably would not have time to use the spa voucher until next year. Robert accepted the iPad from me without much reaction. "Expensive," he muttered, setting it aside. I tried to steer the conversation toward my life, eager to share something that might finally matter. "I just got back from New York last month," I began, Our team won an award for the campaign we ran with a major automotive company. It's one of the biggest projects I've ever handled. We're expanding into Ohio next year, creating over 200 new jobs. For the first time, the room quieted and eyes turned to me. My chest lifted with hope, but before I could finish, my father shifted in his chair. "That's fine," he said firmly. "But remember, family is more important than work. Money and awards don't mean much if you forget where you came from." The silence that followed was heavy. Sandra smoothed Ella's hair and nodded in agreement. Beverly pulled out her phone. Ron cleared his throat. My mother began to ask Sandra about the school Christmas pageant. The moment dissolved as quickly as it had come. Like water slipping through my fingers, I sat back, the smile frozen on my face, my heart sinking as I realized nothing had changed, no matter how many titles I carried. No matter how many zeros filled my paycheck, to them I was still the girl who had left. The one who had dared to want more. And in that moment, surrounded by family chatter and the blinking lights of a tired Christmas tree, I felt the sting of understanding settle in. My success had not moved them at all. They still saw me the same way they always had. And the weight of that truth pressed harder than I was prepared for. The kitchen smelled of cloves and brown sugar as my mother basted the ham. Her sleeves rolled halfway up, while steam rose from the oven. Beverly stood at the counter whisking a bowl of pudding. Her scrubs still faintly smelling of antiseptic, Sandra moved in and out with the confidence of someone who had rehearsed this routine for years. Carrying serving dishes. Checking on the eggnog chilling in the fridge. Barking gentle orders at her children who darted through the room like restless sparrows. I stepped closer, eager to help. Reaching for the cutting board, where carrots waited to be sliced, my mother's hand shot out to stop me. "Not that knife." "Janet," she said, a polite smile masking her irritation. "You don't know how I like things done." Sandra chimed in without looking up from the gravy. She was stirring. "We have a system going. It will just slow things down if you jump in." The words burned, though they were delivered casually. I let the knife rest on the counter and stepped back, folding my arms. I wanted to say that I had cooked entire holiday meals in my Chicago apartment, that I had hosted clients and friends with spreads that would rival any catered event, but in that kitchen, in my childhood home, none of it mattered. My experience disappeared in the shadow of their certainty that I did not belong. The conversation flowed without me, as they shared inside jokes and talked about past Christmas dinners. I lingered near the doorway, forcing a smile when someone glanced my way. But the distance between us felt like a wall. Ron appeared briefly with Megan, offering to set the drinks. And even his small contribution seemed welcomed. Mine had not been. As the table was prepared, I followed the sounds of clattering dishes into the dining room. The long oak table, worn smooth by decades of family meals, stretched across the room under a lace cloth my mother had used every holiday since I could remember. The plates were mismatched, some from old sets, some chipped, but carefully laid out with silverware and folded napkins. I counted as Beverly placed each setting. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. I froze. There were 9 of us. I glanced toward the tree where Sandra's kids sat on the rug with toys, their laughter bubbling over. My heart thudded as realization sank in. Beverly adjusted a fork and brushed past me. I forced myself to ask lightly, "Did you miss a spot?" "There are 9 of us." She looked down at the table, counted again, then shrugged. "Oh. The kids will eat in the living room. That leaves 8 here." My chest tightened. 8 at the table, 9 in the family. One of us didn't belong. Sandra walked in carrying a bowl of green beans. Without missing a beat, she said, "Janet, you can grab the kitchen chair. It's fine for one night." The kitchen chair, the small wooden stool with one leg shorter than the rest, the one we used as children to reach the counter when we wanted to sneak cookies. It barely rose to the table's edge. I opened my mouth, then closed it again, feeling the heat crawl up my neck. I fetched the stool. My footsteps heavy, the scrape of its legs against the hardwood floor echoed louder than it should have as I wedged it between Sandra and Beverly's places. I sat down, my knees bending awkwardly, my chin a little lower than everyone else's. The symbolism was undeniable. I was literally beneath them. Dinner was served with the usual bustle. Platters passed back and forth, steam rising from mashed potatoes. The glossy surface of ham sliced thickly onto plates. My father took the head of the table, lifting his glass of eggnog to start a blessing. His deep voice filled the room with authority as he gave thanks for family, for tradition, for the strength of roots that held us together. I bowed my head with the rest. But the words struck differently. Roots were supposed to anchor, not strangle. As the meal unfolded, conversation hummed around me. Sandra detailed the school pageant she was organizing, her children's roles, the costumes she had helped sew. My mother's face shone with pride. Beverly shared a story about staying past her shift to sit with a patient's family. And everyone murmured about how selfless she was. Ron talked about a new house he was helping to frame with his crew. And my father nodded approvingly, calling it honest work. I shifted on the stool, the edge digging into my legs. I waited for someone to ask me something. Anything. I waited for them to remember that I too had stories, victories, long hours spent building something larger than myself, but the moment never came. My attempts earlier had already been smoothed over, dismissed in the kitchen like my hand reaching for the knife. I forced food into my mouth, chewing without taste. The voices rose and fell around me like a tide that pulled me under. Every laugh, every nod of approval, every smile directed across the table reminded me of where I sat. Lower. Separate. Grace leaned in from the living room doorway, her little voice piping up about the new markers I had given her. For a fleeting second warmth touched my chest, but Sandra hushed had, telling her to let the adults talk, and the moment slipped away. I lowered my gaze to my plate, the colors of ham and carrots blurring. The stool creaked under me as I shifted again, painfully aware of how ridiculous I must have looked. They had not prepared for me. Not really. They had invited me home but had not made room at the table. The sound of forks against plates filled the silence inside me. Above the clatter and chatter, I saw their faces lit by the dim glow of Christmas lights. And I realized that no matter how far I had come, in this house I was still the outsider, and as I sat there, just slightly below their line of sight, I knew that this chair was not just a seat, it was a verdict. The conversations around the table carried on as if I were invisible. My mother leaned toward Sandra with her hands folded delicately in front of her plate, her eyes glowing with admiration. She praised Sandra's ability to juggle 3 children, manage their school activities, and still organize the Christmas pageant at the elementary school. She said it was a rare gift to see such a devoted young mother, a woman who put family first above all else. Sandra's cheeks flushed with pride as she glanced around the table, waiting for her siblings to join in the admiration. Luke puffed his chest a little as though his mother's accomplishments were also his own, while Grace and Ella simply giggled as they picked at their food. When my mother turned her attention to Beverly, her voice took on that reverent tone again, the kind she had never used when speaking about me. She told the table how Beverly had stayed past her shift 2 nights earlier, sitting with a patient's family in their darkest hour. It was a story Beverly had already told once in the kitchen, but my mother repeated it in vivid detail as if to cement her daughter's selflessness in everyone's mind. Beverly offered a small, shy shrug, the kind of modesty that comes with being praised often. Though I could see the faint smile tugging at the corners of her lips, Ron cleared his throat next, eager to add something of his own. He described the progress his construction crew had made on a new house in the neighboring town. He spoke about the young couple who had bought the lot, how satisfying it was to build something lasting with his own 2 hands. My father leaned back in his chair, his expression softening into something I rarely saw, He nodded in approval and declared that honest work like that was the backbone of America. Megan squeezed Ron's arm proudly while he smiled, soaking in the praise. The glow around the table was palpable. Admiration passed back and forth like a current, each sibling basking in the warmth of it. I sat with my fork hovering above my plate, my palms damp against the handle, my heart racing with the urge to speak. I could not let this pass. I needed them to hear me, to understand that my work mattered too. I cleared my throat, my voice trembling slightly at first. Our firm just wrapped up a major campaign with an automotive company. I began. It will bring 220 new jobs to Ohio. Good jobs. Steady pay. Opportunities for families here. It's one of the biggest projects I've ever led. For the briefest moment, the room actually fell silent. Sandra's eyes flicked toward me. Beverly's brow lifted slightly. Ron paused mid-bite. Hope swelled in my chest as I thought this might be it. The moment they would finally acknowledge that my career had value, that I was not just the one who left, but someone who had built something meaningful. But before the silence could stretch into recognition, my father set his glass down hard enough to rattle the silverware. The thud silenced the children's chatter in the next room. His gaze locked onto mine. Cold and unyielding. Family is more important than any of that, he said. Awards. Money. Jobs. None of it means anything if you forget where you came from. I swallowed, my throat tight. But before I could respond, he leaned forward. His voice like steel. You don't deserve a seat at this table. You walked away from this family years ago. And now you think you can come back and throw your money around, like it buys you respect. The words cut sharper than any knife. My fork slipped from my hand and clattered against the porcelain plate, the sound echoing louder in the silence that followed. My breath caught in my chest as every pair of eyes turned to me, then flicked nervously back to him. Sandra pressed her lips together, as if holding back agreement but unwilling to say it aloud. Beverly shifted uncomfortably in her chair, her eyes darting to her phone resting beside her plate. Ron looked down, his jaw tight, his shoulders slumping as if caught between loyalty to his father and the truth staring him in the face. Even my mother said nothing. She simply reached for the serving spoon and adjusted the potatoes, as if she could smooth over the sharpness of his words with food. Heat rushed to my face, burning beneath my skin. Tears pricked at the corners of my eyes. But I fought them back, blinking hard, refusing to let them fall. My father's voice echoed in my mind, louder than the clinking of silverware or the muted murmurs of conversation trying to start up again. You don't deserve a seat. The stool beneath me creaked as I shifted, painfully aware of how low I sat compared to the rest of them. My knees bent at an angle that made me feel small, diminished, almost childlike. The symbolism was unmistakable. He had not only spoken his verdict, he had made sure it was seen. Embodied in the very chair I occupied. I wanted to speak. I wanted to shout that I had not walked away from the family, but had been pushed aside, ignored, dismissed, until it hurt too much to keep trying. I wanted to remind them that while they were praised for their devotion, I had been building something that mattered beyond the walls of this house. That my work created opportunities, supported communities, impacted lives. But my voice caught in my throat, strangled by the weight of their silence. The chatter resumed around me, forced and awkward. But no one looked directly at me. Sandra asked Beverly another question about the hospital. Beverly nodded and shared a detail. Ron took a bite of ham and muttered about lumber prices. My mother passed the rolls, her eyes sliding past me as if she could pretend the words had never been said. I sat frozen, my hands clenched tightly in my lap, the sound of my father's condemnation reverberating inside me like a drumbeat. Each second that passed pressed harder on my chest, until all I could hear was the thud of my own heart and the echo of the sentence he had delivered in front of everyone. And as I blinked against the tears threatening to fall, I understood that the humiliation was not just in his words but in their silence. Not one of them defended me. Not one of them said, I belonged. In that moment, it felt as though the verdict had been unanimous. The weight in my chest grew too heavy to ignore. My hands trembled under the table, my nails pressing into my palms as if I could keep myself from breaking apart. My father's words still hung in the air, thick and suffocating, and everyone else's silence cut sharper than knives. Something inside me hardened. I could either sit there, bowed and diminished, or I could finally stand. I pushed back the little stool, its uneven legs scraping across the hardwood floor with a piercing screech. Every head turned as I rose, my chair lower than theirs, but my body suddenly taller. The air around me sharper. My fingers found the stem of my wine glass, cool and thin, and I lifted it with deliberate calm. The ruby liquid trembled only slightly as I raised it to shoulder height. If I don't deserve a seat at this table, I said evenly, my voice carrying across the room, then stop spending the money I earn. The words cracked like glass. For a moment time stopped. The laughter of the children in the next room fell silent. The hum of conversation died, mid-breath. And all I could hear was the pounding in my own ears. My mother's lips parted as though to speak. But no sound came. Her chest rose sharply. Her breath caught halfway. Sandra's mouth fell open, her fork frozen in her hand. Beverly's utensils slipped from her grasp and clattered against her plate. The sound startling in the silence. Ron lowered his gaze, his shoulders sinking, his face shadowed in shame. I stood tall, the glass steady now in my hand, and let the words settle over them like snow covering the ground. No one moved. The blinking lights on the Christmas tree reflected in their wide eyes, casting faint colors over faces suddenly pale. The silence stretched, long and raw. I could feel every second as if the clock on the wall had slowed to mark them. My father's jaw tightened, his hands gripping the arms of his chair, his eyes, hard and unyielding, locked with mine. He had always been the immovable wall, the voice of judgment, but now he had no words. It was Sandra who finally broke, her voice higher than usual. Janet, what are you saying? Her fork hovered midair as if it could anchor her. I took a slow sip from my glass, the wine bitter and warm on my tongue. I am saying that if you think my work means nothing, if you think I have no place here, then perhaps you should ask yourself how much of this family is standing on what I provide. Beverly's eyes widened, her lips parting as if to protest. But nothing came out. She simply stared. Megan shifted uncomfortably beside Ron, her hands fidgeting in her lap. My mother's face flushed, her fingers tightening around the napkin on her knee. Still, my father said nothing. His silence was heavier than stone, his glare the same one that had silenced me my entire childhood. But this time, I did not shrink. The atmosphere had shifted completely. The warmth of dinner had drained away, leaving only tension, pressing on the air like a storm about to break. The scent of cloves and cinnamon from the ham turned sour in my nose. My chest felt both hollow and burning. But I held my ground. You don't mean that, Beverly whispered finally, her voice trembling. I turned to her, my eyes sharp. Don't I? Sandra shook her head, her earrings brushing against her cheeks as she moved quickly. Janet, it's Christmas. Don't ruin this. I almost laughed. Ruin it. I raised the glass slightly. No, I am simply telling the truth. The words hung there, unflinching, and not one of them reached for a response. My father's knuckles were white where he gripped the chair. My mother finally placed her napkin down, her hand shaking as she did. But she still would not meet my eyes. I felt the power shift then. For years, I had been the one sitting lower, quieter, smaller. But in that moment, standing above them with my glass lifted, it was not me who was diminished. It was them, bound by their silence, By the realization they dared not speak. The blinking lights of the Christmas tree continued their slow pulse, casting the room in red, green, and gold. But the holiday warmth was gone. The air was brittle. The cheer snapped like an ornament shattered on the floor. And as I lowered my glass, setting it firmly on the table, the sound echoed in the stillness. The verdict had been reversed, and they knew it. My heart pounded in my chest as I looked around the table. Their silence clung to the walls, heavy and suffocating, and I felt every eye on me. I straightened my shoulders, the trembling in my hands gone now, replaced by a calm that felt almost foreign. "You think my money means nothing," I said. Muy voice steady. "But for the past 2 years, this house has stood because of me." Sandra's fork stopped halfway to her mouth. Beverly's phone slipped slightly in her hand. My mother's face stiffened as if she already knew where I was headed, but prayed I would not say it. I lifted my hand, counting on my fingers as I spoke. $1,300 every month for rent, $350 for electricity, $450 for groceries, $100 for internet, $150 for Ron's car insurance. I paused, letting the numbers sink in. That is $2,200 every single month, 24 months. $52,800. The clatter of Beverly's fork hitting her plate cut through the silence. Sandra blinked rapidly, her lips parting in disbelief. "Wait," she stammered. "Rent. What rent? This is Mom and Dad's house." I shook my head slowly. "No, it hasn't been theirs for 2 years." My father's chair creaked as he shifted, his jaw tightening. My mother's hands gripped the edge of the table, knuckles white. Sandra's voice rose, high and sharp. "That's impossible. They've owned this house since before we were born." I met her eyes, unflinching. "Not anymore. Dad sold it 2 years ago to cover medical bills after his surgery. He never told you, and when the payments fell behind, when the bills stacked up, he called me. I have been paying every month so you would all have a place to come back to." The room went still as stone. Beverly's breath caught in her throat, her face paling. Ron's eyes darted to our father, searching for explanation, but found none. Megan's hand flew to her mouth as if to keep words from spilling out. Sandra turned on my father, her voice trembling with fury. "Dad, is this true?" Robert's face hardened, but he said nothing. His silence was louder than any admission. Beverly leaned forward, her hands pressing flat on the table. "You let her carry this, all this time. You let Janet pay." My father's nostrils flared. He opened his mouth but closed it again, his jaw working as though he was chewing the truth he refused to swallow. I pressed on, unwilling to stop now. "Do you know how many times I got off a plane in Chicago, exhausted from 12-hour days, and then wired money so the lights here wouldn't go out? Do you know how many times I skipped things I wanted so that you, Dad, could keep the illusion of control, so you could sit at the head of this table and act like nothing had changed?" My father slammed his palm against the arm of his chair. "That's enough." "No," I said, my voice rising for the first time. "It's not enough. It will never be enough for you. Will it? You demanded loyalty. But when I gave more than anyone, you spat on it." Sandra's eyes burned with anger as she turned back to him. "You lied to us. You let us believe everything was fine." Beverly's voice cracked as she whispered. "And you let her take the burden alone?" Ron shifted uncomfortably, his face red, his gaze dropping to the table. "My car insurance." He said it so quietly it was almost to himself. "You've been paying that too?" I nodded once. "Every month." He slumped back, shame etched across his face. The sound of the clock ticking in the kitchen filled the silence that followed. Each second scraped against my nerves as I waited for someone, anyone, to break the tension. Finally, Sandra pushed her chair back. Her eyes glistened, her voice sharp. All this time we thought you were selfish. Janet. All this time we thought you didn't care. He swallowed hard, blinking back the heat in my own eyes. I did care. That was the problem. Beverly's hands shook as she reached for her water glass, her knuckles knocking it against her plate. Why didn't you tell us? Dad. Why didn't you say something? My father's face twisted. A mix of pride and shame, anger and defeat. He stared at me. Not them. His voice low and tight. Because it was not their place to know. Sandra let out a sharp laugh. Bitter and broken. Not their place. We live here. We are your children. But his silence came again. As hard as stone, my mother finally whispered, tears pooling in her eyes. I told him to say something. He refused. I looked at her. Then at each of them. My chest heaving with the weight of all I had carried. I never wanted recognition. I said softly, I only wanted to help. But tonight, after all your words, after all your silence, I am done being invisible. Every head at the table turned back to my father. But he could not meet their eyes. His lips pressed tight. His shoulders stiff. His silence damning, and in that moment, it was clear to everyone. The truth was no longer mine alone. It was his shame, too. Laid bare, under the glow of Christmas lights that no longer felt warm. Sandra was the first to break the silence. Her chair screeched against the floor as she shoved it back. Her face flushed and trembling. Dad, you lied to all of us, she shouted. Her voice sharp enough to make even the children in the next room quiet down. You let us believe this was still our home. That everything was fine? While Janet has been the one keeping the lights on, Beverly's hands trembled as she pressed them flat against the table. Her lips parted, her breath shaky, and she whispered, I feel sick. You let me come here after 12-hour shifts, carrying groceries and cooking meals. And all the while Janet was paying bills I didn't even know existed. How could you not tell us? Ron shifted in his chair, his face turning a deep shade of red. His eyes darted to me, then to our father. My car insurance, he said quietly, his voice filled with disbelief. You've been paying that too. I nodded slowly, my throat tight. Every month. Ron. He slumped back in his chair, shame burning across his cheeks. He rubbed his hands over his face and muttered, God. I didn't even know. My father's voice rose suddenly, louder than the others, his pride refusing to crack. Enough. I am the one who makes decisions in this house. Your sister only helped because I allowed it. She was not saving us. She was assisting me. His words hit like a slap. I stood there, my breath catching, my body shaking from the storm inside me. My voice cracked as the tears I had been holding back finally spilled over. I saved this family. I cried, my chest heaving. I gave and gave until I thought I had nothing left. And you still made me feel like an outsider. Sandra turned toward him again, her finger stabbing the air in his direction. You let your pride destroy everything. You couldn't stand the thought of admitting you needed help. So you let her carry the weight in secret. Beverly's voice rose next, angrier than I had ever heard it. And you let us believe she was selfish, that she abandoned us for money and success. All the while she was the one paying for this roof over our heads. That isn't just pride. Dad. That's betrayal. Ron slammed his hand against the table, rattling the silverware. I should have known something was wrong. I should have asked more questions. But no. I just assumed Janet had turned her back on us. He looked at me then, guilt thick in his eyes. I'm sorry. Janet. I shook my head, the tears hot on my face. Sorry doesn't change the years I spent begging for your approval. Sorry doesn't give me back the nights I worked until midnight just so you wouldn't lose this house. Megan, quiet until now, spoke softly but firmly. This isn't right. Janet deserves better than this. The room erupted all at once. Voices colliding in anger and shame. Sandra shouted that she had been made a fool of. Beverly cried that she had been robbed of the truth. Ron cursed himself for not realizing sooner. My mother sat pale and silent, her eyes fixed on her plate, tears streaking her cheeks. My father pounded his fist against the table, the ham platter shaking with the force. Enough, he bellowed. I am still the head of this family. No one stopped this time. Sandra snapped back that respect had to be earned. Beverly accused him of caring more about his pride than his children. Ron demanded to know how long Dad would have let this charade continue if I hadn't spoken up. I clutched the back of my chair, sobbing openly now. Muy voice ra. I sacrificed everything to hold this family together. And still I was never good enough for you. I was the one you dismissed. The one you shamed. The one you told tonight did not deserve a seat at this table. The room dissolved into chaos. Plates clattered. Voix rose. Accusations flew across the table like knives. Years of resentment poured out. All of it ignited by the truth, finally dragged into the open. The Christmas lights blinked behind us. A cruel reminder of the holiday, meant to bring us together, now casting shadows over a family splintering before my eyes. And as I stood in the middle of it, tears streaming down my face, I realized there was no undoing what had been said. The battle lines had been drawn, and Christmas had become a battleground. I pushed back from the table, the stool scraping across the floor with a sound that cut through their shouting. My tears blurred the faces around me, but my voice came out clear, sharp enough to silence them. I am done. No more rent. No more electricity. No more groceries. No more insurance. Starting tonight, every single payment stops. You can figure it out yourselves. The room froze. Sandra's mouth opened as if to argue. Beverly shook her head in disbelief. Ron lowered his eyes again, and my father sat rigid, his jaw clenched, refusing to speak. My mother's trembling hand reached for mine, but I stepped back before she could touch me. I walked to the hallway, my heels clicking against the floorboards that suddenly felt foreign beneath me. The glow of the Christmas lights seemed to mock me now, each blink a reminder of the illusion I had kept alive. I grabbed my coat from the hook, slung my purse over my shoulder, and stepped outside into the biting winter air. The cold hit me hard, but it was grounding. I marched down the walkway, past the sagging lights and the cracked steps, and slid into the BMW, waiting in the driveway. My hands shook as I gripped the wheel, my breath coming fast and shallow. For a moment I sat frozen, staring at the house I had fought so hard to protect. The windows glowed warmly against the snow, but inside was nothing but chaos and resentment. With a trembling exhale, I started the engine. The sound rumbled through the still night, and I pulled out, the tires crunching against ice and gravel. My chest tightened as the house grew smaller in the rearview mirror until it disappeared entirely into the darkness. The drive into downtown Cleveland felt both endless and fleeting. My mind replayed every word, every glance, every dismissal. My father's voice declaring I did not deserve a seat. My mother's silence. The shock on my siblings' faces when the truth finally spilled. My hands were still shaking when I pulled up to the Marriott, the valet stepping quickly into the cold to take the car. Inside, the lobby glowed with gold and white decorations, polished marble floors reflecting the soft twinkle of garlands and wreaths. The warmth enveloped me as I checked in, giving my name, forcing my voice steady, though my body still trembled. By the time I unlocked the door to my room, the weight of it all hit me again. The room was spacious, elegant, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline. The lights of Cleveland sparkled like jewels against the black winter sky. I closed the door behind me and pressed my back against it, sliding down until I sat on the carpet, my face buried in my hands. For a few minutes I let myself cry freely, the sobs shaking me until there was nothing left but exhaustion. Then, wiping my cheeks, I pulled myself together. I had to follow through. I reached for my phone and scrolled through contacts until I found the number I needed. David Harper. My attorney in Chicago. The one who handled all my financial contracts. He answered on the second ring. His voice calm and professional, even at the late hour. Janet. Everything all right? No, I said. My voice raw. I need you to cancel every automatic payment linked to my family. Effective immediately. Rent. Utilities. Insurance. All of it. He paused, perhaps surprised by the urgency in my tone, but then replied firmly. Understood. I will file the requests first thing in the morning and confirm when they're complete. Thank you, I whispered, relief flooding me as I hung up. The phone buzzed almost immediately afterward. Mom. Her name lit up the screen, glowing accusingly. I stared at it, my thumb hovering over the answer button. For a moment I heard her voice in my head, pleading, softening, trying to pull me back with guilt. My throat closed. With a shaky breath, I pressed decline. It rang again. This time Sandra, then Beverly, then Ron. Each call rolled into voicemail until the buzzing became unbearable. Finally, I silenced the phone entirely and set it face down on the nightstand. I walked to the window, the city stretching out before me in glowing streams of red taillights and bright white lamps. My reflection stared back in the glass. Eyes swollen. Face pale but steady. Behind me the room was warm and still. A quiet contrast to the storm I had left behind. I poured myself a glass of water from the minibar, sinking into the plush armchair near the window. The city hummed below, alive with people who had no idea of the war raging inside one suburban home. My family was unraveling. But for the first time in years, the unraveling was not my responsibility to fix. I leaned back, pulling the blanket draped over the chair across my lap, and let the silence wash over me. For once, I did not feel like the outsider begging for a place at the table. I felt like someone who had finally walked away, leaving behind the weight that was never mine to carry. The Christmas lights outside flickered across the skyline, and I sat watching them until my breathing slowed, the tightness in my chest loosening. Somewhere across the city, my family was scrambling, their voices raised, their illusions shattered. But here in this room, surrounded by warmth and quiet, I let myself rest, knowing the choice was finally mine. The first envelope arrived in early January. My mother sent me a picture of it before I had even finished my morning coffee. The bold red letters stamped across the front read, "Final notice from Ohio Edison. Payments overdue. Disconnect scheduled." Her message that followed was short, almost desperate. Janet. What do we do? I stared at the screen for a long moment, then set the phone down without replying. This was the reality I had warned them about. And now it was no longer mine to solve. By the second week of January, the calls had shifted from pleading to frantic. Sandra left me a voicemail, her voice sharp and panicked. The power went out for half the day, she said. The kids cried because the heat cut off, and we had to light candles in the living room. Do you know how cold it gets here in January? I closed my eyes, guilt pricking at me, but I refused to pick up the phone. Beverly's voice came next, tired and hoarse from exhaustion. I picked up double shifts at the hospital, she said. I need the extra hours. I cannot believe we are in this position. I just cannot believe he never told us. Then Ron's call. Shorter, angrier. Without insurance, I could lose my job. Janet, do you understand that I need my truck for work? You think you proved a point, but you might have ruined me. I sat at my desk in Chicago, the city lights sparkling outside my office window, listening to their messages pile up. Each voice carried a different weight, but the same thread of panic ran through them all. For the first time in years, They felt what it was like to live without the safety net I had quietly woven beneath them. By the end of the month, another letter arrived. This one from a man named Mr. Green. He was the property owner. The one my father had sold the house to 2 years earlier. His tone was formal. Clipped. Almost cold. Rent overdue by 60 days. Legal action forthcoming if unpaid balance not cleared within 7. Sandra called again. Her voice breaking this time. Dad never told us about this man. He just acted like nothing had changed. We all believed the house was still ours. I don't even know how to explain this to the kids. I pictured her standing in the kitchen. The children watching. The stack of unopened mail trembling in her hands. The thought tightened my chest. But I stayed silent. My father's silence, however, was no longer an option for him. He could not walk into the living room and command respect with his posture or his glare. Every decision he had hidden was now exposed. Every lie unraveling. My siblings no longer looked to him for answers. Sandra shouted at him. Beverly refused to sit at the same table with him. Ron stormed out more than once, his boots pounding against the floorboards as if he wanted the whole neighborhood to hear his anger. My mother tried to keep the peace, but her voice no longer held weight. She called me once late at night. Her tone fragile. He has lost them. Janet. They don't listen to him anymore. They blame him for everything. And maybe they should. I sat on the couch in my Chicago apartment. The Christmas tree I had left up still glowing softly in the corner. Its lights twinkled against the glass of my window, reflecting in the city skyline beyond. My own home was filled with warmth. The hum of the heater steady. The refrigerator full. The image of my parents' house contrasted painfully in my mind. Lights flickering. Bills piling up. Voices raised in blame. A house that once carried the illusion of security, now drowning in its own darkness. The storm of calls and messages slowed by February. Not because the crisis had passed, but because they had realized I would not answer. They were left with each other, forced to wrestle with the truth, to claw through the mess my father's pride had buried them in. And I remained in Chicago, sitting in the glow of a Christmas tree that still burned brightly long after the holiday had ended, knowing that their world had gone dim without me. The phone rang one evening while I was reviewing reports at my kitchen table. I glanced at the screen expecting to see Sandra or Beverly again. But the name froze me in place. Robert Whitmore. My father. For weeks he had stayed silent, too proud or too angry to reach out, letting the others do the pleading. Now his name glowed across my phone, and my hand trembled as I picked it up. His voice was nothing like the commanding tone I had grown up with. It cracked at the edges, low and unsteady. Janet. It's me. I listened without answering. My breath tight in my chest. He went on, each word dragging heavy. I was wrong. I let my pride blind me. I thought I could carry the image of strength, of being the provider. But I was drowning. I should have told you. I should have told all of them. He paused. The silence filled with the sound of his uneven breathing. I need to say I'm sorry. I know I cannot undo what I said at that table, but I am asking. Not as the father who failed you, but as a man who has nothing left to hide. Will you give us a chance to fix this? I closed my eyes, the sting of his words still echoing from Christmas night. The humiliation still raw. Part of me wanted to hang up, to let him feel the silence I had lived with for years. But another part of me, the part that had always longed for his acknowledgement, kept me rooted. I will listen. I finally said, my voice measured. But this time it will not be on your terms. He agreed quickly. Almost too quickly. Relief breaking through his tone. David Harper's office. He said, your lawyer. Neutral ground. We will all be there. A week later, I walked into David's downtown office. The familiar smell of polished wood and paper filling the air. The conference room was wide, with tall windows overlooking the frozen river. The city dusted in snow below. My father sat at the far end of the table, smaller than I had ever seen him. His shoulders rounded, his hands folded tightly in front of him. My mother sat beside him, her eyes red, her hand resting over his as though steadying him. Sandra sat stiff in her chair, her jaw tight, arms crossed. Beverly looked exhausted, her scrubs wrinkled. A coffee clutched like a lifeline. Ron shifted uncomfortably beside Megan, his eyes flicking between me and our father. David entered last, carrying a neat folder, his calm voice breaking the silence. Thank you all for coming. He took his seat at the head of the table and opened the folder. We are here to discuss a plan moving forward. As it stands, Janet has carried an extraordinary financial burden for this family. That cannot continue. He slid a sheet of paper across the table. This agreement outlines a contribution plan. Each of you will commit to a share of the monthly expenses. The amounts are based on your current incomes. It is designed to be fair. To distribute the responsibility equally, Sandra reached for the paper first, her eyes scanning quickly before narrowing. This is more than I can handle. David's voice remained calm. It is proportionate to your income. You will not be asked to pay more than you are able. Beverly leaned over to look, her hand trembling slightly. I can pick up more shifts. It will be hard, but I will manage. Ron's face burned red as he read his portion. I should have been covering my insurance from the start, he muttered, his voice low. I will handle it. All eyes turned toward my father, but he stared at the table, silent. That is where I stepped in. I will not carry this alone anymore, I said firmly. I will help if I choose, not because I am expected to. And let me make something clear. If any of you dismiss me again, if I am treated as less than part of this family one more time, I am gone for good. No calls, no payments, no second chances. The room went still. My words hung heavy. Undeniable. My father finally lifted his eyes. Metmine, for the first time. I saw no anger there. No wall of judgment. Only defeat and a glimmer of remorse. You are right, he said, his voice breaking. If there is to be a family left, it will only be because of you. Sandra shifted in her chair, her lips pressed tight. But she did not argue. Beverly nodded faintly, her eyes glossy. Ron leaned forward, his hands folded, his voice soft. We will do better. David closed the folder and folded his hands. Then it is agreed. Each of you will sign. The responsibility will be shared. I looked around the table, at the faces that had once judged me, dismissed me, silenced me. Now they were humbled, confronted with the truth. My father, once unshakable, now bowed by his own pride. My mother, once complicit in her silence, now weeping softly. My siblings, once so quick to call me selfish, now forced to admit their dependence. It was not peace. Not yet, but it was clarity. And clarity was something I had fought for my whole life. I placed my hand on the table, my nails clicking softly against the polished wood. This is your chance. Treat me as I deserve, or lose me forever. No one spoke. The weight of my words settled like a final stone on the foundation of a new beginning. One they would either build on or watch crumble again. The year passed slower than I expected, marked by smaller calls, occasional family meetings, and long stretches of silence where I wondered if the cracks could ever truly be repaired. By autumn, the conversations had softened, less about blame and more about responsibility. I did not forget the sting of that Christmas night, but I watched as each of them made small changes. Sandra picked up a part-time job at the school to ease the bills. Beverly cut back on overtime, balancing her schedule without expecting me to fill the gaps. Ron kept his insurance current, his pride shaken but steadier. Even my mother called more often, not to complain, but to ask about my life, my work, my happiness. And my father, the one who had always towered above us, seemed smaller in every call. Humbled but more human. When December came again, I hesitated before saying yes to another holiday at the house. The memory of that stool and his voice telling me I did not deserve a seat was still raw. But when my mother called and said simply, "Janet, we would like you home for Christmas. There will be a place for you," I felt something in me give way. The drive into town was quiet, the snow falling in soft sheets against the windshield. As I turned down the familiar street, I saw the house outlined in lights brighter than I remembered. A new wreath hung on the door. And through the window, I saw the glow of a tree standing tall and full. Not leaning or tired like the year before, my father opened the door before I reached it. His hair was grayer, his face more lined, but his eyes held something different. He stepped aside without a word and let me in. The warmth of the living room wrapped around me. Sandra's kids raced past with their new toys. Beverly hugged me tightly, and Ron gave me a quiet nod of acknowledgement. When we moved to the dining room, my breath caught. The table was set with care, every place marked. And this time there was no missing chair. At my father's right hand, where no one had ever sat before, was a seat waiting for me, a real chair. Sturdy and high-backed. Not a stool from the kitchen. My name was written neatly on the card at the setting. We ate in a quieter rhythm than in years past. The air less sharp. The conversations more careful but sincere. Sandra talked about her work at the school. Beverly shared a story about a patient's recovery. And Ron described a new construction site. Each time, they paused to ask about me. And each time I answered, without the weight of needing to prove myself. When the plates were cleared, my father lifted his glass. His voice shook slightly. But the room fell silent as he spoke. "Janet, you saved this family, not just with your money, but with your courage to stand up when we all failed you. You taught me what respect means. For that, I thank you." The words struck deeper than I expected. I felt the sting of tears in my eyes but steadied myself, breathing through the swell of emotion. For the first time, I was not the outsider trying to earn a place. I was simply there. Recognized. Respected. Finally, part of the circle. I raised my glass slowly. My hand steady this time. "Respect is not something you buy," I said softly. "It is something you demand when you know your worth." The clink of glasses echoed around the table, a sound that carried more weight than any gift or meal. My father's eyes met mine. And for once, I did not look away. That night, as laughter returned to the house and the tree lights reflected in the window, I felt a peace I had never known here. It was not perfect, and it never would be. But it was enough. And now I want to ask you, the ones listening to my story, have you ever felt like an outsider in your own family? Sitting at a table where your presence was questioned or dismissed, have you ever reached a point where you had to stand up and say enough? Share your story in the comments. Because you are not alone. If this journey spoke to you, like this video and subscribe for more. Sometimes the most powerful seat you can claim is the one they said you did not deserve. And once you take it, no one can take it away again.